Communicating value for something that is easily taken for granted, easily invisible to our daily lives, is something that is immensely difficult.
Welcome to Ground Truth from Eden, People+Planet. We invite you to join us as we explore proven approaches to nature-based climate solutions through real-world experience and measurable results. We're showing what's possible when we invest in nature's capacity to address climate change. Ground Truth, nature-based climate solutions in action.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Glen. I work with Eden, People+Planet, and we're here to start a new podcast to tell everyone a little bit about who we are, what we do, where we came from, but most importantly, where we're going. And we're pretty excited about what is ahead for us and what's happening. So, as I said, I'm Glen, and I'd like to introduce you to Bryan Adkins, Eden's CEO, just to get a little started. Bryan, tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks, Glenn. Nice to be here, and great to see an initiative starting a new podcast on Eden, People+Planet, and the journey that we've been on. I think it's an exciting one. I was raised in East Africa and spent a lot of my childhood in the bush, on safari, hunting, fishing, and enjoying the outdoors in a lot of ways. I had a father who was really diligent about getting us out into the outdoors, so really sort of focused us on how special that was and how precious it was as well. I went to school and came to the U.S. for university, and I started studying biology and then nursing, public health, and went back to East Africa as a nurse in the early days, working for NGOs, working in conflict and post-conflict areas, and had that sort of chapter of my life unfolding. But the more things we saw in the field and what we saw that people were struggling with in terms of healthcare, the more convinced I became that there was this inextricable link between the health of environment and the health of people and the health of communities, and the outcomes of those things were what communities are suffering with. And when you start to see you're treating individuals at the patient by patient level, you really start to say, well, actually, there's a cascade of other impacts here and a cascade of other causal roots as well. So thinking about things such as, well, for example, why is food security such an issue? Well, soil productivity has been heavily degraded in this area, or deforestation has caused a lot of erosion, so we're losing topsoil. Why are waterborne illnesses such a big issue? And degradation around water sources became a really big thing as well. So slowly my career started building on this theme. After about 10 years, went back to university and did a degree in natural resource management with an emphasis on forestry and climate change, and got back into the field and did a lot of work around early carbon projects and about working on restoration and forest conservation as well. So that's sort of my early story.
And I think you'd mentioned to me earlier, we've talked about this before, that you had a stint with the Canadian government and working in policy and also working with one of the UN programs.
Yeah, so I worked with the government of Alberta in Canada for a couple of years, working on trying to take improved forest management techniques and work them into their carbon emissions offset system, and worked as a policy advisor to the provincial government and on a couple of the federal working groups as well. So got exposure to sort of the policy side of climate and land use, particularly in the land use sector, what we call AFOLU, which is agriculture, forest, and other land uses. Also spent some time with the UN, both with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN and with the United Nations Environment Program based out of Nairobi. So
great. So Eden got its start back in 2005 when we responded to a request from President Haile Mariam in Ethiopia. From there, we've gone into multiple countries in East Africa, South America, Asia. We've done a lot of work. And over 20 years now, Eden has amassed a lot of experience. We've done a lot of different kind of settings that we've worked in, different environments, microclimates. Tell us a little bit about the journey of Eden and what we learned from Eden, which takes us to the point where where we are now, where we've over the last couple of years have said, what's next for Eden? How do we need to engage this market space?
That's a good question. So Eden started off as an organization that wanted to address poverty issues. So it was from its start wanting to address the issues of the human condition.
That's excellent.
And so that was something that was obviously a noble cause and whatnot. But understanding that there's an inextricable linkage between people and their environment is something that was sort of inherent in the first thoughts of it. The idea in Eden's early days was to raise money through donations and whatnot in order to hire people to plant trees. And it was sort of a simple theory of change. If you give people jobs to plant trees, that it gives them income, which obviously increases their ability to spend on the things they need. And for many years, Eden kept growing on that model, and it grew and grew and grew from 2005 onwards. And millions of trees got planted in different places across the globe. But one of the things with trees is that planting is sort of one of the first steps. You obviously have to see that tree is part of a larger system.
Right.
And that system is what supports human well-being and thriving. It's not the tree itself that supports human well-being and thriving. So we started to see, as data was coming back from the fields, like, well, maybe tree planting alone is not the way to sort some of these more systemic issues. We need to be thinking in a way that encapsulates the whole system, and in a way of thinking about all the internet connected parts and how those are affected over time by different management, by different activities, by different interactions with the communities that rely on them and that are interacting every day. And so we started to really just think, well, there's a much greater need for longer temporal commitments to these communities and these areas that we're focused on, and we need to be thinking about larger areas and thinking about all of the intricate parts of those.
Right.
So there's a lot of interconnected parts that we have to be thinking of. So we started changing our model in response to that and transitioning away from a focus on only planting trees and actually focus on seeing trees as an input to a much bigger series of activities and series of programming.
Right. So the journey between reforestation and restoration is the same that you already experienced, where we were meeting the independent and individual needs of symptoms and treating symptoms from a medical point of view and realizing there's an environmental impact that if we don't deal with degraded environment and the ecosystem services, it won't support long-term health. And now, so planting a tree is the absolute right way to meet the symptom. If we have degraded land, we're going to need to replant these trees. We need to reforest. But as you've said, the system thinking behind this is the key.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have got, if you think of things only in sort of dealing with the symptoms, and you put Band-Aids on the symptoms, you're actually not going to be able to address the core causes.
Right.
So we need to be thinking when it comes to landscape restoration and moving from reforestation to restoration, we're actually changing our thinking from thinking about putting Band-Aids onto things to thinking of what are the core drivers of deforestation and degradation, just like we would look at the core factors in health. Right. What are the causal agents? And then that type of thinking requires you to think about the whole system and think about all the different interactive parts and addressing and designing programming that can address the drivers of deforestation, the drivers of land degradation, and addressing those. There's a whole cascade of other benefits and impacts that one can have by taking that systems approach.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit. I think it's important to define some terms as we go along. So let's talk about drivers of deforestation, because I know from our experience and the general experience that if the Band-Aid is simply planting trees, then when all the trees are planted and the people have been employed, once that stops, there's nothing stopping them from going right back to where they were 1, 3, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so they'll have the same demand and they'll have the same extraction, they'll have that same balance unless something has changed. So what you're talking about, tell me a little bit about what are common drivers of deforestation such that the systems approach begins to address them.
So I think when we talk about drivers of deforestation and degradation, we're talking about things that are sort of if we create sort of a pool of proximal drivers and a pool of distal drivers. So there can be things that are driving the change in that landscape at source. So the need for more land to have agriculture on, for example, there's a proximal driver. The distal driver then would be the need to make money off of that agriculture and be part of a market economy. The economic situation, the socioeconomic situation, may be a more distal driver. So we have that happening, but the drivers of deforestation are basically the things that are the pressures that people experience in life that push them towards the clearance of additional forest or the degradation of the forest and other resources, land resources. As that sort of is a declining return, causes sort of a cascade of other degradation as well and other deforestation. So it can be something that creates a sort of momentum of its own. So if you don't design programming that addresses what those things are, you end up in the situation where, yes, you have people employed to plant trees, but after that, what happens? What happens when that money runs out? There's no sort of sustainable programming that takes the pressure off of the forest. And that's what we're trying to do now, is we're trying to look at things as a forest, a system,
Correct.
and then take the pressure off of that system so that it can either recover naturally or it can recover with the help of other management activities that we put in place, we design with the community.
Let's talk a little bit about this design process, because what I see is the connection you're making is really clear, that the Eden that began 20 years ago to alleviate poverty, to meet the needs of people, is still core to who we are. That we're going to do that, but in order to do that well and to do that for generations to come, we have to take a broader look at how we do that and design a more thorough plan. And working with nature is a peculiar thing, because it's not something that you can go down and buy the kit out of the box and say, great, it's time to reforest or restore this period. This is what you do. There's step A, B, C. It's not the same for every place or in every environment. So there's a process that you were talking about of design.
Yeah.
So walk me through a little bit. How do we start? What does that look like? The process of designing restoration for generations.
Let me start by first saying tree planting will likely always be something that is part of what we do, because tree planting is an input and we need to be also, pulling together inputs to put into a landscape for it to be restored.
Yeah.
There are other inputs as well, but tree planting will be part of what we do. And it's an important part of what we do, but it's not the only thing we do anymore. When we talk about restoration and the design of the plan, it's a consultative process. We work with local stakeholders in a landscape. We look at that landscape from the systems approach, as we said, and you say, well, this is what defines that landscape. It's all of these different systems that are interacting, and it may be, for example, a big watershed. And using the example of a watershed, we're saying what the communities that are all dependent on the water from this watershed are then by default also dependent on the health of the forest that's there, right? Because the health of the forest drives the water cycle, the hydrological cycle, and therefore the soil stability, all of these other things. The fuel wood that comes from the forest often is used in the local area as well. All of these things make people dependent on that system. So then we look at that system through that lens and we assess the health of that system at the beginning. So what is the health of the system? Well, this system may be heavily degraded. There may have been a huge contraction of the forest. The water levels in the rivers have gone down. We've seen the wells dry up. We've seen an influx of population from another area that was degraded that have come in. Now the fuel wood resources are depleted, etc. So we take kind of a baseline of what the health of that system is, and then we try to reverse engineer with heavy input from community stakeholders, from key informant interviews, from other organizations that are working in the area, as well as best practices from literature, from science that have been proven elsewhere. And we design a plan with activities that take the pressure off of that system, and which include things like active replanting. It may include managed natural regeneration. It may include reintroduction of biodiversity. It will also include things that address some of the more distal drivers of deforestation, the health centers, for example, and how people are getting their fuel at the household level, whether that's firewood or there's alternative fuels, and some of these other distal pressures that the forest is undergoing. All of that is part of the design process. And then, of course, after that design is approved and mutually approved by the communities that are going to be involved in implementing it, then obviously the financing of those interventions has to come along. So that's the next big challenge.
So before we get to talking about finance and how we get people involved and what the connection points are, so as Eden has made the shift,
Sure.
and now we're coming at things with a more holistic, systemic approach, design, working with stakeholders, we're looking for long-term things. Let's talk about Eden as an organization. So what are we doing and how are you leading the organization itself to meet the needs to accomplish such a Herculean task?
So over the last 3 years, Eden's gone through a huge transformation.
Yes.
We have gone from an emphasis on hundreds of different planting sites across the globe to a focus on fewer landscapes in fewer countries, but a much longer commitment and a much larger commitment to fewer landscapes. And we use the landscape as the language of the unit of restoration. We're talking about a system of interacting parts. And so that is what we call a landscape. So the focus moving from trees and planting trees
Yes.
and numbers of trees to how do we manage a landscape has been a huge transition.
Yes.
And we've been making that transition over the past 3 years. What that has meant functionally within the organization is the need to fully integrate a lot of technical skills with a lot of field-based operational skills. Very, very, very critical, both parts are. And then, of course, the financing side of all of that as well. So adding a lot of additional capacity on markets and engaging with markets, on ability to structure deals to finance these types of things as well. But what gives it validity and credibility is the integration of the technical work and strong technical analysis, assessment, design, and tracking of indicators, monitoring, reporting, verification, all of these types of things integrated with getting it done on the ground. There's not a lot of organizations that are actually doing this stuff on the ground. There's a lot of partnerships. There's a lot of segments in this market, but there's not a lot of people that are fully integrated. And so we believe that being fully integrated is really, really important. We call that, putting that technical and operational ability together. It's a standards-based approach because we're following external standards on best practices, on what has and hasn't worked, and we're combining that with our own observations from the field. Mm-hmm. Really, really important to be reintegrating what the lessons you're learning are from the field. And we integrate that according to a standard. Externally can be audited, can be validated. And then we approach this through an adaptive management process. So we design these things, we implement them, then we get that data back into the organization, look at it, say, actually, that didn't work well. Despite what the literature said, that didn't work in this context. Despite what, it may have worked in some other country, in New Zealand or Argentina, but didn't work in Zambia. So now let's integrate a continuous learning space into this and adapt the way we're doing things so that we're working this plan to its logical conclusion.
Right. And so as you're saying that, what I'm thinking is when we find a place where we have degradation and land is, for whatever reason it is, and we have to sleuth out what those reasons are in order to construct this and design a plan. the original forests and landscapes that were there took hundreds and thousands of years to find a natural rhythm and a symbiosis and a balance within itself. And now that has been taken away for whatever reason, our drivers of deforestation. And now our work is to mimic nature and the natural process. And so we design a solution where we have to come in with a variety of different approaches and systems, methodologies, knowledge base, and solutions, including which seeds, which species, which ways, and how to do it so that we can jumpstart the natural process. So when we're thinking about that kind of complexity, what is it? What's the tipping point for that natural process for us to understand, to get in there to do it right? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
When you're dealing with nature, nature's constantly in flux.
Yes.
And I think that there's too much of a focus right now on getting it right, getting it perfect.
Good.
And that is something that I think causes either a delay or it causes people to never act because they want to have a perfect design. They want to have a perfect implementation of a project that's just, going to have 100% success. That's not reality. You have to be prepared to fail, and you have to be prepared to possibly waste time, energy, money in learning. And that's what we're constantly learning about nature. The idea that science is settled about how nature reacts to X or Y stimulus is just not borne out by the everyday management truths.
Right.
And ensuring that you're doing adaptive management is one of the ways we try and mitigate some of that uncertainty, because we're trying to constantly adjust what our management and what our activities look like as they're implemented. There are hundreds of variables you're trying to think about in this. It's not a clear-cut science experiment that you would do in a lab. And far too many people are actually approaching restoration of landscapes, restoration of ecosystems in that way, as if there is a clear-cut way to do it. It's just not, that's not how it works.
Right.
And I think if you talk to land managers all over the world, people who like farmers, people like, people working in the conservation things, rangers, park managers, things like that, they'll tell you right away, it's like, yeah, you have science, you try and apply that as best you can, but science is just a tool for understanding your observations.
But I think it's going to be helpful. You were talking about that process and how you do that, and it takes time. I was thinking about high school chemistry and having to learn the discipline of like titration. And you have a graph paper and you have to titrate it. You try it by 1 drop or 1 mil at a time, and you watch and you note and you watch and you note. And it's like, what am I doing? Why are we spending an hour doing this kind of a... But that's how science is done.
Yeah.
And that's how we learn. And if nature is always in flux, and we have to understand, and something you have said before that I think is really critical, is there's a difference between uncertainty and risk.
Sure.
And dealing with nature is always uncertain because it's always changing around us. But that doesn't make it risky. In fact, the work of restoration and well-designed and implemented restoration is a de-risking behavior and process all in itself.
Absolutely. So when we talk about restoring nature, there's a lot of, if you ask people to invest in that, there's this perception sometimes that, nature's a bit uncertain, nature's a bit risky, and they conflate those two ideas.
Right.
And I'd much rather put my money in a very well-known technology that's proven, and the uncertainty boundaries are, minimus in that. And they, people try and invest in things that they're certain about. That's human behavior.
Sure.
It's rational behavior.
Sure.
But the conflation of risk and uncertainty when it comes to nature-based solutions, and we talk about nature-based solutions to climate change, nature-based solutions are a major component of what we have in the toolbox to deal with climate change. Conflating those two ideas is really quite dangerous because it creates a lack of action. It creates an apprehension. And so what we're trying to do is say, look, investing in nature is not a risky behavior. Yes, it is uncertain because there are fluxes in nature.
Right.
But nature is pretty constant over time. Fewer things in life that are as constant as nature. We've had a lot of impact on it, but nature's pretty resilient over time. Where we're trying to say, the difference is by investing in nature now, you're actually de-risking the future.
Yeah.
This is a de-risking behavior, investing in nature now. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about investing in processes that sustain all of us.
Correct.
They sustain our industries, they sustain our economies. For example, we all depend on what we call ecosystem goods and services.
Okay.
Ecosystems, goods, and services are essentially things we get from the earth, from the natural world, for free. That if we had to take those concepts and work them into our balance sheets, work them into our cost of production, work them into all of our things, would likely bankrupt all of us if we didn't have them. And the idea, for example, take a farmer who's planting a field that all of our cereals come from, for example. If he had to go out and hand pollinate each thing in that field, go from corn stalk to corn stalk, pollinating, cross pollinating, that corn and everything that we depend on in our economy that's made of corn would cost a heck of a lot more. We don't have to do that because we have bees, we have other pollinators, we have things that cross-pollinate on our behalf. They're externalized to the cost of production, but they're absolutely essential to our ways of life, our economies, our health and welfare. If you had to internalize those things into the cost of production, it would mean that we could not afford half the things in the world that we depend on for free. The same applies to water and hydrological cycling, soil stability, all of these things, soil health and well-being of being in a forest. All of these things are ecosystem goods and services, and we are trying to restore those with the landscape approach. If we externalize all those costs, we don't have quite the same understanding of the value that those things provide for us. And therefore, we don't necessarily see the merit in investing in nature today. When we implicitly take that in and explicitly put it into the factors that we're considering in terms of costs, we start to realize that investing in nature now is actually a de-risking behavior for the future. And that's really the crux of the reasoning why it's so important to be investing in nature now.
So I think that one of the reasons that conversations like this are so important is you were talking about how there's a decoupling or a separation of the individual human experience in the 21st century to the actual process, natural process that have gone on since time began. And we don't think that. We just have to go to our closest market to get the food we want. It doesn't matter if it's in or out of season. I want the food that I want. And meat just comes on styrofoam trays. And we go down the line of we have a consumer consumption basis. And this is not to be a political statement even on a sociological level, but to say we're so disconnected from natural process, it's hard for us to find the value point to invest. And you've talked about investment and engagement, and I think it's important then to talk about the outcomes of restoration. You've just listed a whole host of reasons, and I might have to list a few more. But there are people who are aware enough of what's going on with climate change, who see the signs around us that are unmistakable. And they say, we want to do something. There's some great companies and organizations who say, we're going to make a commitment. We understand that our process, our business has an impact. We can do something. And for the last 10 or 20 years, it's been really easy to say, plant a tree. The tree has become the symbol of activity. But I think, as you said, with a tree being an input and not an output, and we've kind of raised it to a level that now has become, it now works against us. We want people to be ecologically aware. We want them to have a way to and a pathway to invest in making a difference in the future through, nature-based solutions. But now that you start talking about restoration, the prolonged process of science, that there's methodologies, that we're talking about a 40-year restoration project of thousands or tens of thousands of hectares,
Yeah.
it still provides employment. It still meets the needs of people and communities, but it does so much more, but it's just so slow. How do we communicate these benefits, these outcomes that we all need, that we all implicitly believe in, but we don't have something to say, oh, what do I get for my dollar? And that has been one of those difficulties in having conversations, even in the philanthropical community, in the development work that we do, is how do I communicate that value that is such a long, long process?
Yeah, it's a difficult proposition. Communicating value for something that is easily taken for granted, easily invisible to our daily lives, is something that is immensely difficult. And people have to really want to be seeking that out.
Yeah.
People have to really want to be curious about what is this, and why is it important before they start to, get engaged.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. Where I think we need to do a better job at telling stories and talking about this is communicating how this does impact people's daily lives, and not just someone across the globe in Mozambique or Zambia or Nepal. This impacts our daily lives wherever we are, in Europe, the US, Canada, wherever. And so it's incredibly important that we start to be more sophisticated in how we tell these stories, but also tying it back to people's daily lives. People want value. I understand that, and they want to understand what do they get for investing in nature. What's the return? And that's hard to communicate sometimes. So there are things that we are starting to use as proximate values. For example, carbon credits and offsets, emissions offsets. We use those as an approximation, especially from the nature-based side of things,
Correct.
as an approximation for value of an intact system or of a system that's being restored. And so that communicates, that's what people can rally around, because it is some sort of tangible thing that they can invest in. We're doing those types of projects both in the philanthropic world and in the carbon markets world as well. In many cases, those are actually blended finance streams. So we are actually investing in those landscapes with both types of finance.
I think talking a little bit about how we engage the economics of restoration is important, because I think there's a place for, as we have seen, there's an imperative that the individual have a pathway to engage.
Sure.
And companies have been in the same place of being able to say, we want to make a difference. I think as we have carbon markets coming online, as we have blended finance coming online, working with governments, with the Paris Accord and things like that, coming together, wanting to do things, we're going to have the ability to offer so much more. Tell me, last thought here, what's going to set Eden apart in the way we approach things, that if you were just letting everybody know, Eden has a new identity, a new vision. This is where we are. This is the essential thing we'd like you to know about how we're approaching this now.
I think if I'm to articulate what the essential thing is, I want people to be able to go to the ground where we've been working and see the difference. I don't think no matter what we say, it's not going to be as powerful as when you go there and you can see it, or when you see pictures of the differences. We are, as I mentioned, we're a fully integrated organization vertically, and that we do the financial brokering, we do the technical work, and we do the direct implementation on the ground. And that's really, really critical, because it allows us to control quality, to work on the design from start to finish, and to work on the implementation over long, multi-decade periods. And that is a really important part in maintaining quality, maintaining impact. So I think that's what sets us apart. Do we get it right all the time? No. It's an iterative process. It's a learning process, and it's something that I think people have to be open to. And that's something we have to work with people to understand. It's not going to be perfect, but it is going to be better. One of the big transitions we've made as we've moved from from this idea of tree planting to holistic landscape restoration has been to really focus on not losing the forest for the trees. And the idea that people concentrate on trees, they concentrate on numbers of trees, but planting the wrong trees in the wrong place is ecologically just as damaging as clearing the forest. So we've been really trying to work with nature, to work with communities, and to integrate that into the design of all the projects we do. And in doing so, also ensuring that they have a longer term sustainability and a longer term success rate, or better chance of success.
It's also why Eden was initially set up as a nonprofit organization based in California but serving the world, so that we're a perpetual institution being able to see that this work goes on and will always outlast the people that are currently doing it. We're building it, we're training it, passing it on to the next generation, so this work will be persistent, and that's what we're hoping to do. Bryan, thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you for joining us on Ground Truth. To learn more about Eden's work in landscape restoration and explore partnership opportunities in nature-based climate solutions, visit eden-plus.org. If you found value in today's conversation, please share it with others working to create positive climate action through natural solutions. Ground Truth is a production of Eden, People+Planet.